Hello, my name is Diana Michelle. I'm an artist here at Mount Sequoia. I teach photography and Photoshop through the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, Northwest Technical Institute, and Eureka Springs School of the Arts. And I also have individual instruction here at my studio at Mount Sequoia. So today I'm going to show you how to shoot your DSLR in full manual mode. You will need a camera with full manual capabilities, meaning you can change your ISO, your white balance, your aperture, and your shutter speeds. Those are the four main things that we worry about when we're shooting in full manual mode. I'm going to go ahead and just get started. This is how I teach my basic classes, is on a whiteboard, and it's very effective. So let's just dive right in. First, I'm going to talk about white balance and ISO. So white balance. This is the easiest one to change on your camera. So it's whatever conditions that you're working under. For instance, if I'm shooting outside and it is sunny, I will put it on the sunny white balance, and that's going to help with any contrast issues that I have and so forth. Now, if it's cloudy, I'd put it on the cloudy and so forth. You have several different options there. So I like to set this one first because it's easy. I can just decide what conditions I'm working under, set my white balance, and forget about it. The only time you might have to change during a shoot is when it goes between sunny and cloudy, back and forth. So now, let's talk about ISO. This is basically the same thing as film speed back in the film days. We have 200, 400 speed film, 800, and so forth. The higher that number, the more grainy your photos will be. So in digital photography, we call it ISO, and we can change our ISO. You're not stuck with the whole roll of 400 speed film, right? You can go from 100 to 200, 400, 800. Some cameras will let you go in between these numbers. So we can change that from picture to picture. Now, 800 and above, anything more, you're going to start to notice that digital noise. Now, the more megapixels your camera has, the more it can handle those higher numbers as far as digital noise goes. Now, we want to keep this ISO as low as possible. We only increase it if we have to. We've done everything else and our picture is too dark, we have to increase our ISO. But for now, I like to set it at 100 and hope that I can stay there. So let's talk about aperture now. Aperture is how much light you're letting in through the lens. When you see F and a slash, we talk about aperture. We'll put these on a chart. I like to start at 2.8. These are all full stops right here. So when you're at 2.8, you have a nice big aperture. We're letting a lot of light into that through the lens. This is going to blur out the background, and it's perfect for portraits. As we go down the line, our aperture is getting smaller, even though the number is getting bigger. When we're down here, this is where you want to shoot your landscapes. And this is where you want to do your portraits. Notice at 22 we have a tiny little diameter there. Even though the number is large, this is what we refer to as a stopped down aperture. So as we go this direction, we're stopping down. We go this way, we're opening up our aperture. These are full stop apertures. Now, you'll notice some lenses will allow you to go in between half stops, is what we call it. And you've got these little half stop apertures as well. But for the most part, just remember when you're shooting a portrait, you want to be down here on this end. Landscapes are down here. And because of that tiny little aperture there, for landscapes, we have to make up for that by having longer shutter speeds. By doing portraits, we have so much light coming in our lens, we're able to shoot faster, and that frees us up. It's a little bit easier to take pictures of portraits than it is landscapes as far as exposure is concerned. So now let's talk about shutter speed. Shutter speed literally means how long are we allowing that light to come in through the lens, in through our aperture. And it is measured in general in fractions of seconds. So shutter speed. Now, I'm starting this chart at a 1/30th of a second because that's about where you can shoot handheld, unless you have a really heavy telephoto lens on. And then as we go down the line, we're shooting about twice as fast every time. Less light will be entering the lens. So down here, this is for your stop action photography, sports, moving subjects, those sort of things. You need a faster shutter speed. Now, you can go slower than a 1/30th of a second, but you will need a tripod because you will start to get camera shake at that point. So, shutter speed is measured in fractions of seconds. If we were talking about actual seconds, you would see the dashes after the number. So I shoot a Canon, so when I'm shooting at a 1/30th of a second, it does not give me the fraction. It just gives me that number, 30. I'm supposed to know that means a 1/30th of a second. If I was talking about 30 seconds, you would see 30 with the dashes after it. Pretty straightforward. You want to not have camera shake. You want to use a tripod if you have a heavy lens, or if you're shooting slower than a 1/30th of a second. So now let's talk about how all four things work together, right? We have our white balance. We have ISO. We have our aperture. And we have our shutter speed. So we have four things we have to worry about. Now, white balance is easy. So I'm going to pretend I'm shooting a landscape and it's overcast. That is my scenario. So my white balance for overcast would be cloudy. ISO, I'm going to start at 100 knowing that I may have to increase that number. I have my aperture. I'm just going to put down the most common ones. Okay, we know it's nice and big at 2.8 and small at 22. My shutter speed. I'm going to pretend here I'm shooting handheld landscape. Start at a 1/30th. Go faster and faster as I go down the line. So now, here's everything I need to worry about. Now, I have a meter in my camera. If I am aiming at my subject, at my landscape, and I push the shutter halfway, there's a little dot that's going to appear on my meter. If it's on the left side, it's underexposed. On the right side, it's overexposed. Now, some Nikons have that reversed, so you want to make sure you're looking at it correctly. So I'm going to use my go-to starting shutter speed for outdoors, which is 1/25 of a second, 1/125. I have to have a starting point of some sort, and anytime I'm outdoors, I plug that number in first. So because I'm shooting a landscape, I know that I want to be down here. I want to be stopped down around f/22. Sometimes you can get your lens to go to 29 or 32. So I'm going to be stopped down. That's a little tiny aperture. Not much light is coming through that. So my scenario is the landscape overcast. White balance is cloudy. As long as the sun doesn't pop out, I should be able to stay in the cloudy white balance. My ISO is 100. I can increase that if I need to, but I'm going to try to keep that nice and low. My shutter speed is 1/25 of a second. I'm at f/22 on my aperture. I'm facing my subject, my landscape. Push the shutter halfway. Look at your meter. Look and see if the dot is on the right or the left or in the middle. We want to get it in the middle. I'm going to say for this purpose that we are underexposed. It's too dark. So think about what you can do here. We have an ISO of 100. We have aperture of 22. We have a shutter speed of 1/25 of a second. And I'm shooting handheld, no tripod. So I like to stick with the aperture that I chose. This is where your creative controls are, is with your aperture. So I picked f/22 for a reason. I want lots of detail in my landscape picture. So I'm going to try to protect that and leave that guy alone. So now I'm looking at my shutter speed, and I've got some leeway here. I can go to a 60th of a second. Longer time for the light to come through. And let's say I'm getting closer to the middle. Not quite there yet. So I still have a little bit of leeway. I can go to a 30th of a second as long as I'm not using a big heavy lens. Let's say I'm getting closer but not quite there. So at this point, I can either sacrifice some aperture and let more light in. I don't want to do that. I want just increase my ISO to 200. I'm not going to notice any digital noise at 200. And that should get me right where I need to be in the middle. I'm ready to take my picture now. So now let's put up another scenario. We have a portrait. One person, outdoors, and it's sunny. Not ideal conditions for portraits. Sometimes you gotta do it. So, same thing as before. White balance. That's gonna be sunny. That's gonna tone down those contrast issues that you're gonna have. Now, we have ISO. We wanna keep that as low as possible. On a sunny day, there's no reason why we can't stay at 100 ISO. That should not be a problem for portraits here. So, I'm not going to have to mess with those guys anymore. All I have now is my aperture and my shutter speed. So, with my aperture, you're going to shoot wide open. And what that means is you're going to shoot at whatever your maximum aperture value is for the lens that you're using. So for instance, I have a 70 to 200. The maximum aperture value is 2.8. That's as wide as it will go. I'm going to go ahead and put it at that wide open setting at 2.8. I'm letting a lot of light in here. So that's going to blur out my background because of that large aperture, but also I'm going to be able to shoot this pretty darn fast. The faster you can shoot, the sharper your pictures are going to be. And this is why portraits are easier to expose than landscapes. So now we've got our shutter speed left. That's the only thing we've got left here. So I'm going to start this at a 30th of a second. And remember, we're shooting about twice as fast as we go down the line here. So now remember, my go-to starting point anytime I'm outside is that 1/25th of a second. So I've got everything I need here. Now I'm going to go to my meter, simply going to compose, push the shutter halfway, and look and see where that pops up. So at 2.8, 1/25th of a second, ISO 100 on a sunny day. This is those rare occasions where you will probably be overexposed. So, this doesn't happen very often, but what are your options? We already have our ISO nice and low. We're wide open with our aperture. And remember, this is our creative controls anyway. We don't want to mess with that. We are going to adjust the shutter speed. So rather than going slower like we did in the landscape scenario, we're going to shoot faster. So I'm going to go from 1/25th of a second to 2/50th of a second, and I'm getting closer, yet I'm still overexposed. Just keep going down this direction. Let's say at 5/100ths of a second, I'm right there in the middle, and now I'm ready to take my picture. It's as simple as that. This is not very hard. Get it in the middle for a good exposure. Shoot wide open. So for me, when I do portraits, I like to choose my brightest lens. And so what that means is whatever lens has the best maximum aperture value. So if you look at the front of your lens, it will show you what your maximum aperture value is. Sometimes it's a range. Sometimes it'll say 3.5 to 5.6 or something like that, 2.8. My lens, my brightest lens is the Nifty 50. It's a 50 millimeter fixed lens, and it will go to 1.8. I like to use that one for portraits because it's going to make the background look amazing. It's going to make it look like blobs of color, kind of like an impressionist painting. So for your portraits, you're going to shoot with your brightest lens. So now let's talk about bracketing your exposure. Okay, because we're shooting digital, that means we can take as many pictures as we want. It's not going to cost any extra money or anything like that. So it's a really good time to bracket your exposure. Let's talk about that. So let's say, for instance, I'm getting a really good exposure at f22, 1/25th of a second, ISO 100, and cloudy white balance. And what that means, I'm getting right in the middle of my meter. It's exposed properly. So a lot of times when you get home and you look at your computer, you'll notice that that wasn't quite perfect. Your meter is not perfect. Okay, so what we're going to do is something we call bracketing. We're going to bracket our exposure. Some cameras will allow you to bracket in camera. You can do it automatically. You can find that under your menu. I choose to manually bracket because I'm not sure how far I'm going to take it each direction. So this is a good exposure. Middle of my meter. So whenever I do this, I'm going to shoot one faster and one slower. So 1/25th of a second, I'm going to shoot 1/60th of a second, and then 1/250th of a second. So I've got one slower and one faster. The aperture stays the same, so does your ISO, and so does your white balance. This is simply bracketing your exposure, okay? So sometimes I like to keep going with that. Maybe I'll take 1/30th of a second, and I'll take 1/500th of a second, or anywhere in between. So there's more than one reason to bracket your exposure. So you can do something that we refer to as exposure stacking, meaning maybe my sky really looked good at 1/250, meaning it's not have as much exposure, so it's going to be darker. You're always finding the sky in photography. It's always the brightest area. So as long as I'm using a tripod and everything lines up perfectly, I can drag this sky with this foreground, and maybe over here at 1/30th of a second my mountains look best. So I can combine these three exposures and get the perfect exposure. So let's talk about using the rule of thirds. You can visually divide your viewfinder into thirds, and that is where you're going to put your focal point. A lot of people like to put their focal point right in the middle, but it can be more dynamic by putting it off to one of these thirds. So, for instance, we have a big tree here as a focal point. We're using the rule of thirds in one direction. Now, what if I divided it up the other direction? Now we have the rule of thirds going two directions. Maybe the sky is here, the horizon line, and there's our tree. This is where that intersects. This is going to make for a more dynamic photograph. So, with portraits, it's a little bit different. So, we can put our person off to one of these thirds. Well, which direction? Do we want to be on the left side or the right side? What side are they facing? Is their body turned one way or the other a little bit? That's the direction that you're going to give them the most room. Otherwise, if they're facing this way, this is going to create tension right here. You want to give them room to breathe. So we can use the rule of thirds in both directions with our portraits as well. Maybe our person is right here, they're facing this direction, and here is our horizon line. Here again, we're using the rule of thirds in both directions. So we're also looking for leading lines, okay? So roads, fences, bridges, and because of perspective, if you photograph them straight on, the longer it is, the more you're going to get this vanishing point perspective and converging lines. Right there's your vanishing point perspective. We like to have these type of lines, these leading lines, come in at the corners and settle in the middle of your photograph. Also, when we think about still life photography, perhaps we have a pot of flowers here. Objects tend to look better when they're grouped in odd numbers rather than even numbers. We stick another flower in there, we got even numbers, people start to count things. With odd numbers, they're just looking at it and it's more pleasing. So this is more important in smaller numbers. Once you get past 10, people aren't counting anymore. But with their still lifes, you may consider your subject being in odd numbers. So let's talk about flowers. We have patterns and textures and then all kinds of flowers perhaps, and there's no definitive focal point. Where do you focus? So when you are in this situation, you're going to go about a third of the way into that viewfinder, and then you're going to switch it to manual focus, MF for manual focus, and that is where you're going to focus. Now, one other thing about composition and framing, all four corners are very important, okay? We don't want some funky branch coming in and hitting somebody in the head in the background, okay? For instance, these four corners are just as important as what's going on right here. So, you don't want a blank white sky right here, for instance. Your eye is always drawn to the brightest part of a photograph or anything. Well, guess what? Right here, that blank white sky, there's no ink there. And that's the first thing people are going to look at. So I'm going to walk around a little bit and try to fill this up with maybe some tree branches or change my angle to avoid that bright white sky situation. Now, because rules are made to be broken, when is it okay to do this? Right down the middle. When you have really great reflections, that's when you put it right here in the middle. Also, sky and beach look pretty fantastic right here. Now, talking about the sky and the beach, you can also use that rule of thirds, right? Sky and beach. Well, if the sky looks fantastic, right? We're gonna do it this way. Maybe it's sunset, okay? So if you know what's gonna dominate, what's the prettiest part of your picture, is it the sky or the beach? That's gonna get the most image area. We talked about a lot. Let's put it all together, okay? So now we have a landscape scenario. We're going to say we're doing the landscape and it's during the golden hour sunset. Now, one thing to remember about sunset, every minute you're out there, you're losing light, okay? So your exposures are going to change. Now, our white balance, our little trick there, remember, is that cloudy white balance. It's going to saturate your colors for your sunsets and your sunrises. We want to keep our ISO low as possible. I'm going to put that at 100 for now, knowing that I might have to change. Now, we have our aperture. I'm starting this at 2.8. We know it stops down to 22. That's where we want to be for our landscapes. That's where we're going to get the detail, not down here at 2.8. That's going to blur out the background for portraits. So we have a little tiny aperture. We have to make up for it with our shutter speed. So I'm going to start this at a 30th, but you know, we shoot about twice as fast as we go down the line. So my go-to starting point anytime we're outdoors is 1/25th of a second. And we have f/22 ISO 100 cloudy white balance. We're looking at our meter, trying to get in the middle of our meter. So I'm going to say we're underexposed. That's how we are most of the time. Now, I have some leeway here. I don't want to touch this. This is my creative controls. I'm going to go to a 60th of a second. Getting closer. 30th. As long as I don't have a heavy lens and I'm a pretty steady person, I know this is my limit. For still too dark, if I'm using a tripod, 15th of a second, 1/8 of a second, 1/4 of a second, 1/2 a second, so forth. If I'm not, I have no choice. 200 ISO, 400. You do what you got to do to get the shot. Hope this has been helpful. You can find out more about my classes at DianaMichelleFineArt.com. Thanks for watching.